Good evening. I'm Noel Latif, President of the Foreign Policy Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to one of our Centennial lectures. Dr. Masri, who's going to deliver the lecture, is the Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. He holds a Senior Research Scholar appointment at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA. Previously, he was Vice Dean of Columbia Business School. He earned his PhD from Stanford University in 1988. Dr. Masri has written an insightful book entitled Tunisia and Arab Anomaly, which is the subject of tonight's Centennial Lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Safwan Masri.
Thank you very much, Noel, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. I'm really delighted at your interest in the topic, and I'm very grateful to the Foreign Policy Association for hosting this event. So the title, Democratization or Democracy, Prospects for Democracy in the Arab World, sounds a bit like an oxymoron in that, one must question whether there is a path towards democracy any time in the near future in that part of the world. I'm going to try to turn on the light, but it probably doesn't turn. That's okay. We have witnessed what has been referred to the Arab Spring, uprisings in 2010, 2011, that started with the self-immolation of a fruit vendor in Tunisia in the town of Sidi Bouzid on December 17, 2010, Mohammed Bouazizi. That then spread throughout Tunisia, resulted in the ouster of the autocratic leader Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali in January 14, 2011, followed very quickly also with similar protests in Cairo, that saw the fall of the Mubarak regime, and we thought perhaps there is the beginning of a democratic series of democratic revolutions or revolutions for democracy in the Arab world. What we have witnessed since that time has not been very promising, and when one looks at the civil strife, the humanitarian crises that have ensued in countries like Libya, Yemen, and Syria, when one looks at botched attempts at democratization in a country like Egypt, besides countries that were peripheral Arab Spring countries like Jordan and Morocco that instituted some reforms, we haven't seen much positive change that was hoped for back in the year 2011. So what I'd like to do today is examine basically some of what has happened since 2011, in 2011 and since then, and look at what lessons can be drawn from those experiences and perhaps draw some conclusions as to what the prospects for democracy in the Arab world might look like. And I think, Noel, if I'll speak for 25, 30 minutes, and then what I would love to do is engage in a conversation with you about the issues that we have in front of us. But let me start by saying, let's not take for granted why it is so important to look at these issues. Of course, the stakes are very high, not only for the Arab region, but for the world at large. We live in a moment, of course, where democracy has come under tremendous stress, including in our own country here in the United States. But even some of the world's largest democracies, like India, have been experiencing some stresses on democracy in countries like Turkey, Hungary, and elsewhere. There is great concern sort of about the Western democratic model and where it is and where it might be heading. And of course, for the Arab world, where you have a huge youth bulge, where you have unmet aspirations, and you have, of course, geopolitical conditions that are have been very worrisome for a very long time, it's very important to sort of look at the dynamics within and between the countries of the Middle East. Now, of all the countries that were engulfed in protests in 2011, Tunisia and Egypt deserve special attention because they seem to hold, or they seemed at least to hold the most promise. And there are, at least superficially, a number of similarities between the two countries. So what I'd like to do is focus my talk on Tunisia and Egypt and on lessons that can be learned from those two experiences, and to hopefully draw some wider conclusions based on the experiences of those two countries. Both countries ousted their autocratic leaders, Hosni Mubarak in the case of Egypt, who had been president since 1980, Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali in Tunisia, who had been president since 1987. Both did that without any foreign intervention. In both countries, there were democratic elections that ensued. In Egypt, between November of 2011 and January of 2012, there were elections for People's Assembly of Egypt. Those were followed with presidential elections later on that spring. Mohammed Morsi, who was put forward by the Muslim Brotherhood, was elected president. In Tunisia, in October 23rd, 2011, you had elections for a constituent assembly that brought forward a troika, a coalition of three parties, Al-Nahda, an Islamist party that one could say is more or less like the Muslim Brotherhood, but I argue is a quite different animal than the Muslim Brotherhood. The troika brought Al-Nahda with two secular political parties that shared power since those elections 2011. So 2011, you have a government that's elected in Tunisia. 2012, a few months later, you have a government that's elected in Egypt. Both are Islamist governments. 2013, during that summer, you have the end of those governments. In the case of both Tunisia and Egypt, you had demonstrators asking for the removal of the governments that were in place. But in the case of Cairo, what you end up having is an Egyptian army chief, General Abdel Fattah Sisi, who on July 3rd, 2013, leads a coalition to remove the president of Egypt, Mohammed Morsi, and suspends the Egyptian constitution. On August 14th of 2013, you have the massacre in Cairo with thousands of Muslim Brotherhood members killed at the hands of the army. In Tunisia, by contrast, you have civil society stepping in to form a technocratic government to convince Al-Nahda, the Tunisian Islamist party, to withdraw from government. And you have a different scenario that takes shape at that time. What's interesting, though, is that, again, both countries remove their leaders, both countries bring in an Islamist party into government, both countries get rid of those Islamist governments in 2013, but under very different scenarios. Then, since 2013, you have a continuation of the democratic experiment in Tunisia. And what you have instead in the case of Egypt is that we're back in the throes of a military authoritarian regime that is more oppressive than the Mubarak regime that the Tahrir Square protests of January 2011 removed. So the questions that this raises are, one, what was similar? How come Egypt and Tunisia followed a seemingly similar path? But then, more interestingly, why did the paths going forward become so divergent in the two cases? Historically, there's much in common that unites Egypt and Tunisia. They each have a very strong national identity. They both have legitimate borders, historical territorial legitimacy that dates back centuries, if not millennia. One can safely say that those are the only two Arab countries that can claim that. perhaps with the slight exception of Oman and Morocco. But otherwise, most countries of the Arab world were creations of the 20th century. They were creations of the post-Ottoman Empire days and of the colonial rules of the British and the French and the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Tunisia's history goes back to the 9th century before Common Era with the founding of Carthage by the Phoenicians. That becomes a major force in the Mediterranean, competes with the Roman Empire. That competition leads to 3 Punic Wars. The last one in 146 before Common Era sees the destruction of Carthage, but then Augustus in the year 29 BCE rebuilds Carthage and declares it the capital of the Romanian province of, or the Roman province of Africa. And Carthage becomes as important as Alexandria on the Mediterranean to the Roman Empire. So you have a thriving province that is then you have the Vandals and you have the Byzantines and then you have the Arab Muslims who arrive in the 7th century. You have Berber indigenous people who rule the Muslim sort of, new Tunisia, and then you have Ottoman rule that starts in the 16th century but gives Tunisia a semi-autonomous status. And in the 19th century, as I argue in my book, and as hopefully we will have a chance to discuss towards the end of my remarks, I argue that in the case of Tunisia in the 19th century, you had a nation waiting to become a state. You had a nation that has had a long civilizational history, has had boundaries that today don't look that differently from the boundaries that were drawn up by the Romans at the beginning of the first millennium. You had institutions in place, and you had a reform movement also taking place. You had a constitution that was introduced in 1861, the first in any Muslim land, and 15 years before the Istanbul constitution, which was the first Ottoman constitution introduced in 1876. So you had all the makings of a nation, and then French colonial rule from 1881 to 1956, a very interesting and sophisticated engagement between Tunisian elites and the French occupiers during that period. And then you had independence in 1956 and a nation-building exercise at the hands of Habib Bourguiba, the country's first president. So unlike other countries, from Saudi Arabia to Jordan to Libya to Syria, many of the, or Iraq for that matter, where you had boundaries that were drawn up, boundaries that made some sense, but also did not make a whole lot of sense. And overnight, you had the birth of new states that were looking for nations, that were looking for a national identity. And I would also venture to say that that is part of the problem that we face today when we look at the internal conflicts in many of those countries and divisions along tribal lines, sectarian lines, identity lines. And even in stable countries such as Jordan, a national identity has not yet taken root because of the many divisions, if you will, in terms of identity that make up the population of the country, be it Palestinian, Jordanian, what's called East Jordanian, and Palestinian Jordanian, and then more recently, of course, with the influx of Iraqis and Syrians because of the conflicts around them. So in Tunisia, you had a very different situation. You had a nation that, as I said, I argue, was waiting to become a state. Egypt, of course, has had a very long and much better known and better understood and better studied history, from the days of ancient Egypt, the pharaohs, and so on and so forth, and borders also that did not change much over the past few centuries, if not couple of millennia, except for some variations in the 19th century when Sudan was part of Egypt and then Sudan was not part of Egypt. So you have that history, you have that great similarity between the two countries in terms of sharing a wealth and the richness of civilizational history and of boundaries. You also had two great mosques and centers of learning located in those two places, and a mosque traditionally in Muslim society has been a great place not only of practice of religion and of spirituality, but as a place of scholarship, as a place of education, as a rightful religious institution, when you don't have the same kind of structure or hierarchy that you do in other religions, for example, as in Catholicism. Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, which is the most commonly known one, was established in the year 973, but that was preceded by the Zaytuna Mosque of Tunis, which was established in the year 698. So 200 and some years before Al-Azhar Mosque. And even before Zaytuna in 698, the Uqba bin Nafi' Mosque in the city of Qayrawan, which was established by the invading Arab Muslims into Tunisia, was founded in the year 670. So I'll come back to those because those mosques and religious institutions played a very key role in the dynamics of their respective countries in the 19th and 20th centuries and leading up to the revolutions of 2011. But for now, I just want to underscore the fact that this is another similarity between Tunisia and Egypt in that the two countries are hosts to the most important religious institutions, mosques, in terms of the development of Sunni Islamic thought, to be distinguished from Shia Islamic thought, which thrived in places like Najaf in Iraq and Qum in Iran. Both countries also shared another very important dimension, and that is they both witnessed and hosted what one can say was a 19th century Islamic revival movement. Okay, there were two parallel movements taking place. One in Egypt that is referred to as An-Nahda or Renaissance, and another one in Tunisia that started around the same time. The two were quite different in many respects, but both were a result of an openness to Europe that had not hitherto been found. So the Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 opened a door onto Europe that was never going to be shut, and that created a lot of tensions within Egypt, some positive and some negative. The French occupation of Egypt only lasted about 3 years, but those 3 years were incredibly detrimental or incredibly consequential in terms of the future development of Egypt. One of the things that Napoleon did was establish the Institute of Egypt in Cairo, which was modeled after the Institut de France in Paris, and brought with him lots of scholars. And you know, some of you might know the description of Egypt, the volumes of books that were written about what the French scholars saw as the conditions of Egyptians and the conditions of scholarship or lack thereof in Egypt. Edward Said, my late friend and colleague, refers to the discoveries of or descriptions of Egypt as the starting point of Orientalism as we know it today, and how the Arab world and the East, the Near East, started to be viewed by Westerners. But be that as it may, interaction between Egyptian thinkers and French scholars in Cairo, the likes of Hassan Attar and Jabarti and so on, exposed Egyptians to a new way of thinking, to Western ideas, Western sciences. You had Muhammad Ali Pasha, the Ottoman Albanian ruler of Egypt, and his successor, Khedive Ismail, who were determined to make Egypt more European than Europe. And that was a sort of a motivation behind the big projects, Suez Canal and the modernization of Cairo, which got Egypt into very serious debt. So they sent many of the thinkers, many of the Al-Azhar scholars, because that's where scholarship resided. It did not reside in universities. There were none at that time. The mosques were universities. So Al-Azhar is referred to as Al-Azhar Mosque University. Zaytuna, which never had an official a sort of mandate as a university, had a theology faculty, had madrasas not in the negative connotation that we now understand madrasas to be, only concerned with the teaching of Quran, but madrasas that taught young boys and girls Quran, Arabic language, math and sciences and so on. The Uqba bin Nafi' Mosque of Qayrawan, or the Great Mosque of Qayrawan as it's more commonly known, also had a great scholarship scholarship taking place, the interaction of many Muslim and Jewish scholars, many Jewish scholars also who went back and forth between Andalusia and the days of Andalusia and places like Tunisia and Morocco. The Qayrawan Mosque produced the likes of Ibn al-Jazzar and Ishaq al-Israeli and great scholars of theology as well as great medical scientists. But I digressed. So to go back to my main point, those scholars in Egypt were then sent on missions, on educational missions, and they spent years in Paris. And they came back fascinated with Western ideas, but their biggest challenge was, how do we reconcile this with Islam and Sharia? So they became preoccupied with the notion that they needed to reconcile Western ideas with Islamic values and teachings and Sharia, but that it shouldn't be that difficult of a task, because after all, these Western ideas are not in conflict with the teachings of Islam if one were to take Islam back to its roots and to the time of the Prophet and rid it of all the polluting elements that have affected it and caused its deterioration over the centuries since that time. So Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdo, contemporaries in the late 19th century Egypt, became the founders of Salafism, the original Salafism. Okay? But that was an intellectual Salafism that only gave way to militancy and the political stream in the 20th century for other reasons. But that was the basic foundation, to rid Islam of all the corrupting influences and take it back to its roots and purify it and purify Muslim society. So that movement was going on in Egypt. At the same time, there was a similar movement going on in Tunisia that was not predicated on an invasion like Napoleon's of Egypt, but rather by the openness of the North African coast, European interests, economic interests, and ambitions that started really taking shape in the early 19th century with the rise of Europe, with the abolition on piracy in 1818. You had the opening of trade routes between North Africa, the exploitation, the economic exploitation of places like Tunisia by the French, the Italians, and the British. With that came a lot of ideas that started influencing thinkers within Tunisia. You had great leadership and you had great local thinkers who interacted with their counterparts from the West and adopted many of their ideas, but owned them. So, for example, in 1846, Tunisia abolishes slavery, influenced by the British, and the suggestion by the British in 1842 that they might consider sort of limiting the amount of slavery trade that was taking place in the city of Tunis. To the British consul's surprise, the Bey, Ahmed Bey, decides in a series of 3 decrees to abolish slavery altogether. And he argues from within Islam for the abolishment of slavery and convinces the great scholars and ulama of the Qayrawan Mosque and of the Zaytuna Mosque in Tunis that by allowing slavery to continue, we are doing a disservice to our Muslim fellow men, because even though Islam, through the Quran and Hadith, allowed for slavery, the conditions set forth for the ownership of slaves were humanly impossible to meet. Meaning, the conditions for owning slaves required equity, required fairness, required certain ethical standards that it was argued were impossible to humanly meet. So by allowing a fellow Muslim to own slaves, we are depriving him from the opportunity to access heaven in the afterlife. And thus slavery should be abolished. And indeed it was abolished with the sanction of the Muslim ulama. In 1857, Tunisia introduces a security covenant authored by a local Tunisian, Ahmed ibn Abi Diyaf, that gives Jewish and Christian subjects living in Tunisia rights that they had not had until that point. And in 1861, the constitution is drafted by a local thinker, Khairuddin al-Tunisi. So those thinkers, unlike the thinkers in Egypt, had a more expansive view of reform. Their reform was not only concerned with, or was very little concerned actually, with the reconciliation of Western values with Islam and Sharia. But as you saw, I mean, you know, through the examples I just gave you, there was that reconciliation. You know, if you want to consider abolitionism a foreign idea or a Western idea, that should be sanctioned by Islam. But their reforms had constitutionalism. In 1869, the same author of the Constitution wrote a very important treatise that talked about a constitutional monarchy, talked about representation. It did not use the word democracy, but it basically advocated what we would now consider the democratic thought. And they instituted secular education systems. So what I want to come back to here is that, again, if you look at the similarities between Tunisia and Egypt, there were great similarities, but there were also great differences, and the divergence, for example, in the reform movements, which I'll come back to. But to bring us back to the modern time, so you had also in the cases of Tunisia, and so it's very, very important to look at Nahda today and the Muslim Brotherhood today in the context of Tunisia and Egypt respectively, and look at them with that as a background, and look at the conditions and the environments that each came into. Now, after the revolution, the reason that Nahda and the Muslim Brotherhood won in both of those places was because the two of them were the best organized. Both of them enjoyed integrity in terms of the voting public, because neither of them had ties with the Ancien regime. And if anything, both had been oppressed by Ben Ali in the case of Tunisia and by Mubarak in the case of Egypt. But then both came into power and both became very unpopular because they each tried to push forward an Islamist agenda. The difference, and then in 2013, as I said earlier, both were ousted from government. But in the case of Egypt, it was through a military coup. What happened in the case of Tunisia? You had a civil society organization, the labor union movement, Union Générale Tunisienne du Travail, which led a quartet of civil society organizations. So you had the labor representatives, the business owner representatives, the human rights group, and the lawyers syndicate. They came together, they convinced Nahda to withdraw from power. And Nahda, for the first time in a Muslim country, an Islamist party agrees to peacefully withdraw from government. Okay, seeing the writing on the wall, seeing its decline in popularity in Tunisia, but also seeing what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at around the same time. So they withdraw from government. The quartet then establishes a roadmap and a timeline to see through the adoption of a constitution in 2014 and parliamentary and presidential elections in 2014. And to reward the quartet for its efforts, they are recognized by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee in the year 2015. So totally different tracks. So civil society in the case of Tunisia, military in the case of Egypt. And I argue that what Egypt had in terms of military might, Tunisia had in terms of civil society might in the form of labor union activism. Now, again, both those conditions go back at least 100 years, if not more. In the case of Egypt, from the days of Muhammad Ali and his foray into the Levant up to the borders of Istanbul until he was pushed back by the British and the French in 1840, Egypt has always had a very strong army. Under the coup that brought Jamal Abdel Nasser to power, the Free Officers' coup in 1952 that removed King Farouk and ended any remnants of the Ottoman Empire and colonial rule, was a military coup. Every leader that Egypt has had since then has been a military leader, except for Morsi, who ruled for about a year. Okay? Now, contrast that with Tunisia. Tunisia, during that period of reform in the 19th century, that reform included also military modernization. But failures and high costs of involvement in the Crimean War that cost Tunisia quite a bit, the Bey at the time decided to go back on his modernization plans and to keep the army small in Tunisia, which the French were very happy to maintain at that level. Now, here is the decisive point: independence, post-colonialism, Tunisia versus the rest of the Arab world. Egypt invests heavily in its military. Egypt is involved in a conflict with Israel. Jordan, its legitimacy is drawn from the great Arab army, the great Arab revolt that was led by the current king's great-grandfather. Okay? Syria's Ba'ath, Iraq's Ba'ath, Libya, all of those countries, to establish legitimacy, and the leaders being themselves products of military institutions, build up their militaries. Build up their militaries and build up their militaries around also the presence of Israel in their midst. In Egypt, 1974, Egypt spends 56% of its gross domestic product on its army. Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba, the first president, is distrustful of the army, is distrustful of Jamal Abdel Nasser, is distrustful of the sort of the ploys of his Arab neighbors, and enters the independent statehood phase of Tunisia a far more confident leader than any of his peers, because of Tunisia's long history, because of Tunisia's experience in the 19th century and the early 20th century under colonial rule, and because he was a well-educated person who studied in Tunisia and then went on to the Sorbonne to study before coming back to Tunisia and lead the nationalist movement. He makes a conscious decision not to invest in the army. He makes a conscious decision also to side with the United States in the Cold War. And it makes a conscious decision not to allow Tunisia to be interventionist or confrontational in any way, pleads with Palestinians in March of 1965 to accept the 1947 UN partition plan, and decides not to entangle Tunisia in the Arab-Israeli conflict. What his counterpart spent on the military, he spends on education. Spending on education reaches a peak of 35% of the national budget in 1973. Okay? So, and then, of course, that, I argue, has huge ramifications for the conditions that we see today in the Arab world. Tunisia's education system, post-colonialism, is the only education system that limits the role of religion to 1 to 2 hours a week, is bilingual to limit the infiltration of religion on every subject, mandates the teaching and the learning of philosophy for 2 years in high school, teaches civics, teaches Darwinism, and does everything else. Whereas in Egypt, you have under Mubarak, Al-Azhar Mosque is given control over the education system because it was Jamal Abdel Nasser's way of combating the Muslim Brotherhood. After Jamal Abdel Nasser, Anwar Sadat comes to rule the country from 1970 to 1981. He is distrustful of Jamal Abdel Nasser and of communist threats within his country. He gives power to the Muslim Brotherhood, who then control the education system and start infiltrating textbook and curricula with language that has survived and that has evolved and grown until today. The last thing that Tunisia also does quite differently than Egypt is that Tunisia emancipates women. In 1956, the same year the country becomes independent, Habib Bourguiba adopts into law the Code Statut Personnel, a family personal status code that abolishes polygamy, which today in 2018 is still legal in every Arab country except for Tunisia. Gives women further rights in terms of divorce, repudiation, and so on. 1961, birth control becomes accessible to Tunisian women. 1973, the same year as Roe versus Wade, abortion becomes fully legal in Tunisia. Now, this didn't come from Mars. You know, the reform movement that started in the 19th century, the sophistication in terms of the thinking of Tunisians over that time, the role of Zaytuna Mosque in that reform and that evolution was crucial. What Bourguiba does in 1956 is that he takes a treatise written by a Zaytuna scholar in 1930 that argues from within Islam for the emancipation of women, that argues from within the Quran and the Hadith for abortion under certain conditions. And some of the same arguments used in 1846 to abolish slavery are used to abolish polygamy, meaning that it is humanly impossible for a man to be fair amongst and equitable amongst his 4 wives the way that religion had intended him to be. And polygamy is abolished. So when you look at the scenarios today, you look also at the conditions under which Ennahda was born. Ennahda was a very Tunisian scenario, born in 1981 with an expansive agenda that is political, economic, as well as religious. And it is led and co-founded by Rashid Ghannouchi, who is still the head of it, who was a professor of philosophy, who had studied at Zaytuna Mosque, who had spent 22 years in exile in England studying the ideas of the Enlightenment, who in 2003, while in exile, signs a very incredibly important agreement with secular leaders, Tunisian, in Aix-en-Provence, for what Tunisia would look like as a democratic society once the day comes for it to be such. So Ennahda is voted into power in 2011, but it learns from the get-go to share its power with the 2 other secular parties that it has to share power with. It democratizes over time. It tries to push the agenda, but it is stopped by civil society and by women who take to the streets on August 13th, which is National Women's Day, and also the anniversary of the implementation of the Family Status Code of 1956. Tens of thousands of Tunisian women take to the streets on August 13, 2012, defying Ennahda and defying proposals that had been made by Ennahda for articles to be included in the constitution that would have limited the rights that women had in Tunisia. So women, civil society stand up to Ennahda, but also secular parties stand up to Ennahda. Ennahda withdraws, Ennahda backs off, Ennahda learns to democratize. It learns to politically secularize. So politically it secularizes, and in 2016 it redefines itself as a party of Muslim Democrats and says it is no longer an Islamist party. The Muslim Brotherhood, born in the 1920s in response to the end of the Caliphate, which died with the death of the Ottoman Empire, has a holy agenda that is predicated and based on the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah from the 13th century and Muhammad Abdul Wahhab of Saudi Arabia, and is militant from the get-go and believes in the importance of purifying Muslim society so that God can be kind on that Muslim society. It produces the guidelines, you know, the book Milestones, which was written in prison in 1966 by Sayyid Qutb, a Muslim Brotherhood leader, becomes the guide for Al-Qaeda. It produces Zawahiri, Qardawi, and others who become leaders of Al-Qaeda and other organizations. Sorry, not Qardawi, I said that by mistake. And so on. So the Muslim Brotherhood, with that kind of an agenda, comes in 2012 and believes that it was God's decree that willed its governing the people of Egypt. And everything it does is motivated by that belief. So To sum it up, you have both Islamist parties, both come into power at around the same time, both as a result of democratic elections, both fall in 2013, but both fall very, very differently. And in one case, what saves democracy is civil society, and the other case, what crushes democracy is, of course, the military. And so, there have been many, many scenarios. So in Egypt, people talk about blaming the Muslim Brotherhood for the end of the democratic experience. They say it went too far. It alienated the Egyptian street. It failed to reach across the aisle. Or blame the military. Or blame the secular opposition. On the flip side, in Tunisia, the debate is whether to give the greatest credit to Ennahda for having democratized the way that it did, or credit the labor union and civil society more broadly, or credit the secular opposition. And I give credit to all of those factors. So my conclusion here, for the purposes of this talk, and then we can engage in some questions and answers, and of course the book goes into a lot more than this, but that the prospects for democracy in the Arab world are very dim. And they're very dim because if you look at Tunisia, which is the only democracy in the Arab world, with the exception of Lebanon, which isn't exactly a functioning democracy, but the country manages to function despite its dysfunction. And Lebanon shares a lot, actually, with Tunisia in terms of freedoms that are present only in those two countries: freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of thought. But Tunisia has one freedom that even Lebanon doesn't have. And in Lebanon, a Muslim man is legally allowed to have polygamous marriages. In Tunisia, the constitution that it adopts in January of 2014 includes an article, Article 6, which protects freedom of conscience. The only such constitution anywhere in the Arab world. Article 6, freedom of conscience, which means freedom of thought, which means freedom of belief or non-belief. So Tunisia is the only Arab country where atheism is not illegal, punishable by law. In cases like in Saudi Arabia, punishable by the death penalty. So you had great hope in Egypt, you had great hope in Tunisia. Both countries deserve to have great hope. Both countries shared a lot of legitimacy that underlied their histories. But their more recent history, superficially, as similar as it might look, it is profoundly different in terms of, for example, Zaytuna's engagement with the reform process in Tunisia, whereas Al-Azhar rejected the reform ideas that those travelers to Europe brought back to them. So Muhammad Abdo had to meet with his pupils in his apartment away from Al-Azhar and away from the eyes of the authorities. But more importantly, I place a lot of emphasis on agency and factors that had agency that were all related to reform. Reform in terms of the spheres of religion, education, women's rights, and civil society have been in the making. Those ingredients have been in the making for a very, very, very long time in Tunisia. And I don't see those conditions elsewhere in the Arab world. And out of those, I think the two that are most critical, most important, are education and civil society. Because with those, you have women's rights, you have human rights, you have a more moderate role for religion. So when we look at supposed reforms and reformers elsewhere in the region, everybody's excited about Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. Yes, he's bringing in some reforms, but he has not touched the most important field of reform, and that is education. Because until the language in Saudi textbooks changes, unless the language in their curricula and the way students are taught, how they're taught, what they are taught, until and unless that changes, you're not going to have very significant reforms. The other thing that is very, very important to bear in mind is that it's not sufficient for a ruler to stand up and declare that Islam that is going, or the discourse on Islam that's going to emanate out of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going to be moderate, and you wake up the next day and it is indeed moderate. That conservatism, Wahhabism and the Wahhabis and the Al Saud clan signed an agreement or shook hands on an agreement in the year 1744. 1744. And that alliance has defined Saudi Arabia before it became Saudi Arabia, and certainly has defined it since its founding in the year 1932. So deep reforms in the area of religion, in the area of education, once those reforms start taking shape, then one can believe that there is reform that is taking shape. Reform, democracy is not about opening movie theaters or allowing women to drive at a time when robots can drive cars. So I hate to end on a somewhat pessimistic note, but as a young man last week when I was giving a similar talk in Ramallah told me, he said he found a lot of optimism in what I had to say. And I said, why is that? He said, because you're making us think about the things that we can do and should do in order to get our societies to become more democratic, that these are not vague aspirations that we have. And, you know, of course, that's a wonderful thing to hear, in that there is optimism in all of this. So there you have it. As much as I could pack in, much more than half an hour. I'm sorry and all, but I tried. And I look forward to engaging with you with questions and answers. Thank you. Thank you. Sir. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Professor Gassani from Central Connecticut State University. Thank you very much
Ahlan.
for a very illuminating lecture.
Thank you.
And it was very, very interesting. Of course, most of us knew the answer to the question you posed, the prospects of democracy is very grim. So, you mentioned women's rights and education and the role of civil society. The other countries that succumbed to the Arab uprisings, Arab Spring or Arab Winter or whatever, include Syria, Yemen. In your view, besides, I mean, Tunisia, we talked about Tunisia and the role of civil society, but Tunisia was ruled, by Ben Ali for a long period of time. No democracy under this.
Right.
What, in your mind, can you come up with a certain framework of analysis that states might embrace to promote democracy? Is there a likelihood that might happen in the rest of the Arab world?
Right.
You do a comparative analysis, but
yeah.
I'm concerned about the rest of the Arab world.
Sure. No, thank you. I mean, let me say a couple of things which will sound controversial about this. So I think the notion of an Arab world is rightly being questioned. Okay, what is the Arab world? What does Mauritania have in common with Jordan? What does Somalia have in common with Tunisia? Okay, what's common among Arab nations, as we call them, is language. They're Arabic speaking, but even language in some of those countries, in Africa, for example, Arabic is a second language, okay? Second to the local language of the country, or of the region. The notion of Arab unity, I think, was a mythical notion created by pan-Arab aspirations, put forward and propagated by Jamal Abdel Nasser and by the Ba'ath party leaders and then movements in Iraq and in Syria. And it failed. Of course, Saad al-Husari in the 1930s. So, let's say between in that period, yes, there were nationalists like Saad al-Husari in Iraq and others who advocate for this. Interestingly, in the 19th century, the Muhammad Abdos and Jamal al-Din al-Afghanis, who were concerned with Islamic revival and were concerned with reform, never spoke of Arab reform. They always spoke about, and Hubb al-Watan the love of homeland, was a concept introduced into the Arabic lexicon by Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, okay? But al-Watan, the homeland, was Egypt. It was not the Arab land. It was not the Muslim world. Egyptians were very proud of their Egyptian heritage, and they saw that as a unique heritage, okay? Not all countries that are Muslim are Arab. Actually, 20% of Muslims around the world are Arab. 80% are non-Arab. It was only until Jamal Abdel Nasser that Egyptians started thinking of themselves as Arab. Until Jamal Abdel Nasser, Egyptians referred to Bedouins in their midst and to people from the Arabian Peninsula, modern-day Saudi Arabia and Yemen, as Arab. So let me put this. And then those attempts at pan-Arabism and Arab unity failed, a miserable failure. And 1967 and the humiliating defeat with Israel should have put a lid on those aspirations. It didn't. The reactions to December 6, 2017 and Trump's announcement of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the reactions by the Arab world is putting a lid on that mythical notion of an Arab nation. The Arab Spring, we keep saying, you know, it wasn't really a spring. It wasn't really a spring. And it's right, it wasn't really a spring. But it also wasn't Arab. It wasn't Arab. You know, Egyptians in Tahrir Square were not fighting for anything that is related to an Arabism about them. It was very local. It was economically driven, very local. In Tunisia, it was about Tunis. In Dar'a and then Damascus in Syria, it was about the economic grievances of Syrians in Syria. Okay? So, you know, just to put that there. I think understanding this context is really important, because then you focus energies on particular specificities of a situation and of a nation state, as opposed to thinking what happened in Tunisia could happen elsewhere, or the scenario of Egypt can or cannot be replicated in another country. So I think, you know, my first piece of advice for thinking about these matters is to think more locally about the dynamics, the environment, the conditions, and the aspirations. Now, there are commonalities among them. You know, economic grievances are common, you know, among the poorer countries of the region. And, you know, you now have splits that are unprecedented. I mean, you know, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia against Qatar, for example, and the preoccupation with Iran and what that means geopolitically and strategically.
Federico Rantini, U.S. Bureau Chief of the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. For a journalist, first of all, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. But speaking as a journalist, I was impressed by a remarkable absence, which is us, the West. And I remember how during the Arab Springs, the coverage by Western media was almost obsessed with our role. And even after the failure of the Arab Springs, the discussion here was, what did we do wrong? What mistakes did Obama do? Why did we miss the opportunity? From the absence of the topic in your presentation, should we assume that we are not so important as we believe to be?
Thank you, Federico. That's a terrific question. And so some of my friends and people, you know, thinkers in the Arab world who have talked to me about my book have said, you know, you don't point enough to the agency of the West, you know, to what the West. And I said, my response to that is not to vindicate the West and to say that there was no role. But what I'm more concerned with, and as an Arab, and by the way, I'm Jordanian. I mean, I grew up in Jordan, and I'm American. We see and we hear enough about the vilification of the West, the vilification of, and you know, certainly, you know, don't get me wrong, the United States deserves so much blame for the conditions of that part of the world. Britain and France, what they created during the and after the First World War explains much of what we are seeing here today. But what I was more interested in is Tunisian agency, Egyptian agency. I'll use the word Arab with the qualifier that I gave it earlier, Arab agency. Meaning, I don't feel that there's ever enough attention given to taking ownership of problems that countries and societies in that part of the world have experienced. Because it's very, very easy to blame everything on America, on Israel, on the West more broadly. Now, a lot of that blame is deserved. A lot of that blame is deserved. But you don't get out of the abyss without taking some sense of ownership over the problems and focus on what is it that is within your control. And the things that I speak about over here are things that require tremendous political power by the leadership, by the leading and the led, actually, because it requires grassroots movements to get those things to change. But yes, you're absolutely correct in that, I do not mention this, I do not talk about it. That is not to dismiss it. It's definitely there, but that's not my focus or interest.
Thank you so much for mentioning the women emancipation. That was why I came here.
I saw you going like this.
I met Tunisian women, I was in tears. So I just think, just like this gentleman, and then piggyback on his tale, you're not mentioning anything about us in China as well. Xi Jinping have Silk Road, one belt, one road. And Turkish people think they're more European. Marrakesh, the Moroccan people, they're European. Somalia, of course, it's not only language. China has many, many languages, but China at one time was one big country.
Right.
Mongolian and so forth and so on. So what is your prognosis, pros and cons, with Xi Jinping? Is he trying to colonizing the Africans and or, no, God forbid, like the Middle East? So is it going to be positive?
Oh, goodness.
The communism.
Okay.
Wait. Socialism actually went over democracy. So it's really,
I love tough, challenging questions, okay? But tough, challenging this one takes the cake, because I love tough, challenging questions that have something to do with what I know something about. So, but I mean, I'm not to claim ignorance, yeah. Yeah, so the relationship between China and Africa is an incredibly important one. And I think you're right. I mean, you mentioned something about, coming back to power. I think what people often forget about China is that for the longest time, it ruled the trade routes of the world. It ruled the world economically. It had a blip that was about 100 years, if you will. So what we're seeing right now is a resurgence of China's power. It's not something that's coming out of nowhere. It's not something that's new. Listen, I mean, I think the policies of China in the world are incredibly important to look at and to study and to examine. And I have colleagues who do that day in and day out, and they could offer a far better answer than I could ever dream of offering. But, I think creating a balance in the world in terms of power, economic and otherwise, my view of China is that its interest is in terms of economic relations and economic power around the world, and far less geopolitical interests, except perhaps in its immediate neighborhood. I think there's a lot that's very positive coming out of China and out of Xi Jinping, but there's also a lot to be said about human rights and their suppression.
Could I narrow the question in terms of foreign influence? France, you mentioned that Habib Bourguiba was educated at the Sorbonne. Did that education influence his outlook in terms of his commitment to education in his own country.
Very much so. But it didn't all come from France. So again, I mean, Tunisian agency, and this is very important, and I think, you know, related to Frederico's question also, is, you know, we blame so much on the West, but here's a country that depended on itself and knew how to use the West, okay, in order to get to where it is today. The reforms that took place in the field of education in the 19th century included reforming education at Zaytuna. Zaytuna, as of the 1870s, started teaching modern subjects. Unsatisfied with the limits, because of the limits on the ability to reform Zaytuna, Khairuddin al-Tunisi established Sadaqi College in 1875, the first secular education institution in the entire region, with Italian and French and British teachers as well as Tunisian teachers. By the time the French came to rule Tunisia, there was a substantial, substantive, considerable intellectual elite, okay, that gave birth to the nationalist struggle for independence. That elite included people from within Zaytuna and from outside of Zaytuna. They did not reject everything about French colonialism. And one thing they held on to was education. And they did not want to enroll their kids in the French schools set up by the French for their sons and daughters. But what they did is they reformed their own schools. And you had an interplay between them that really, I mean, the best way to describe Bourguiba is that he is as much a product of the indigenous reform movement as he was also a product of the colonial French power in terms of education. He studied at Sadaqi College, the 1875 indigenous school, graduated from Lycée Carnot, a French school that still stands, and then went to the Sorbonne. Now, the more direct answer to your question is he was definitely very much influenced by his time in France and by the ideas that he was exposed to, and he wasn't alone in this. Many of his colleagues, before him and after him, who worked on the national struggle, when he got independence from the French, he insisted on maintaining a very strong relationship with France, to the country's detriment to some extent, because it got to a point where 80% of Tunisia's trade with the world was with France. So it became too dependent. But the one area that he really insisted on, which I think was brilliant, is retaining French teachers and insisting on bilingualism in the education system, which still rules Tunisia's education system. So he wanted universal education, but he said we're going to do it gradually, because whom do we have to teach our kids? In 1961, after independence, there was a confrontation with the French, a military confrontation. When it was resolved, the one thing he insisted on was that French teachers don't leave until Tunisian teachers were taught how to teach. Everywhere else, you had immediate Arabization of curricula, dismissal of all foreign teachers, colonial teachers, and nobody left to teach them. So it's a long-winded. So shall I take 2 or 3 questions together and answer them? And
my goodness, yes, maybe we can do that. That's sort of a lightning round.
okay, because I'm good. I mean, as long as you're good, I can be here all night. I know, yeah.
Go ahead, why don't we start? Right there.
Dave, thank you for your presentation. Having been born in Pakistan, I can certainly understand the influence of a large and encumbering military. And my question is about the place of civil society in Egypt. How does civil society move forward in a country where, when the trappings of, for example, what Tunisia experienced, which appears to be liberal and Western and foreign, when that is introduced in Egyptian society, it's repudiated and it's fodder for the Islamists.
Right.
For the Muslim Brotherhood. Who in Egypt, the civil society, I'd imagine, is stuck between a rock and a hard place, the military and the Muslim Brotherhood, gets to introduce these liberal ideals packaged in the manner that they were presented in Tunisia.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Informative presentation.
Thank you.
I'm trying to keep my questions succinct. I'm not really even sure how to word it. So one thing that you alluded to just a little while ago is the commonalities in these countries are poverty and poor economic conditions. So my question has to do with how do you reconcile, is there a way to reconcile democracy with lack of economy and lack of hope, lack of future? So it seems like maybe the conversation is not in the right direction. Maybe the conversation needs to be really looking at,
Got
look
it.
at every one of these countries had the spark was economic,
Sure.
really. So I'd like for you to address that.
Got it. Thank you. And the woman in the back.
My name is Elias Isaacs, I'm the president of the Francis York Foundation and Institute. Currently, I have a small center in Old Cairo, Egypt, and I'm working with projects in Uganda and nation in Western Africa, along with having a small developing center in very near Uttar Pradesh in India. And one thing we've been helping with is developing a communications network throughout all of Africa, which eventually will be expanded into various nexus linkage nodes to the internet. Given that the entire world is encompassing slowly but surely the internet, I was wondering what technological and scientific help, thinking of course, my home office based in Old Cairo, Egypt, the center, but at the Arabic world, we could have to help that technologically.
Thank you. Thank you.
I loved hearing about the political and positive political and cultural changes in Tunisia due to the theology of Muslim theology that
Yeah.
was in Tunisia. What is the possibility of that spreading?
Thank you. So great questions, really great questions, and I'll try to give each of them a succinct and you know, give them fair answer. On the issue of civil society in Egypt, so I'll start with the first question and the military. So civil society has deep roots in Egypt, as deep as it does in Tunisia. I mean, that's why I think looking at the two is really important, because on the surface there's so much that's similar between them, and yet the outcomes are so different. In Egypt, labor unionism started in 1919, 7 years before it started in Tunisia. And it grew, especially at the end of the Second World War and the withdrawal of Allied troops from Egypt. The market shrunk in Egypt, or sunk, okay? And that created a lot of economic hardships, and there were lots of strikes and so on. This was just about the time, just before the Free Officers School and Jamal Abdel Nasser came into power. So the labor union was very strong at the time, at the beginning of the military regime of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and it became a thorn in his side, as civil society should be. He crushed it. He crushed it brutally. And in 1957, he closed down all Egyptian labor unions and brought what remained under what he called the Egyptian Trade, Union for Workers or something, okay? ETUF, Federation. That became an instrument of the state. The head of ETUF was appointed by the president, and the head of ETUF also served as the Minister of Labor. And I'll stop there, okay? Because, I mean, you get what it has meant. In Tunisia, it was a very different scenario. I won't go into details, but the labor union movement was inseparable from the nationalist movement for struggle, played a key role in it, and many members of the first few cabinets of the government of an independent Tunisia were leaders from the labor union UGTT. On the issue of religion and that, so when UGTT was founded in 1946, the biggest religious authority in Tunisia at the time, Sheikh Fadel bin Ashur, was there to sanction and to bless the founding of UGTT, and he was made honorary chairman of UGTT. So it had this, you know, that's the beauty of the Tunisian scenario, in that it was never secularism or religion. It was never Zaytuna or the other fields of society. You know, all of these interacted with one another. And I think that that's what could be and should be exported to the rest of the world. Saudi Arabia feels like it has a hold on Islam, and that the narrative on Islam emanates from Saudi Arabia because Mecca and Medina are there, and because of the legitimacy that the Saudi regime has given itself. You know, Al-Azhar has been always politicized. I don't think any meaningful reforms will come out of Al-Azhar. But what I do think that we are entering into is a period where there is pushback. There is pushback on conservative Islam. There is pushback and the failure of political Islam. And I think Iran will prove to be the biggest example of the largest failure of political Islam. We may be entering a period that my colleague Asif Bayat at the University of Illinois coined the term for, which is post-Islamism. So we may be entering that. Science and technology and the power of the internet is so great. In 1996, Tunisia became the first African and the first Arab country to introduce the internet, right? And Ben Ali invested very heavily in the internet, but he also had, you know, his daughter owned a company that was actually a monitoring vehicle for activity on the internet. But the internet that he invested so heavily in was actually a tool that was cleverly used by the demonstrators to topple him. When WikiLeaks in 2010 revealed the level of the kleptocracy of Ben Ali and his family, he had siphoned off something like $13 billion from Tunisian coffers, we know now. WikiLeaks was shut down. Tunis Leaks was created overnight, okay? And social media, of course, played a very, very big role, as it did in Egypt. Now, with the youth bulge in the region, I think entrepreneurial activity, by the way, entrepreneurial activity is key towards democratic society, because that's how you start having young people ruling the day, if you will, controlling their destiny. That's where you have economic hope, but also that's, I think, where you have the opportunities for greater technological innovations. Many of them, you know, are coming out of that region, and where you have sort of, you know, civil society can be a very broad umbrella to capture all of these things. And I think, you know, focusing on the meaning of democracy, to me, electoral democracy may take a very long time to take hold in that part of the world. And the people have to be prepared for that day over a long period of time. In Tunisia, they learned how to debate in school by studying philosophy, by studying the humanities, by studying the liberal arts. Their fathers, their mothers, their grandparents did that as well. There is a culture of consensus building and of compromise, of debate, that defines the Tunisian landscape today. It defines the Tunisian landscape today. It's what allowed for the quartet to safely get the country out of political deadlock in 2013. What allowed Ennahda to democratize over time. That is something that I think that is deeply rooted in education systems. That kind of compromise and that spirit of compromise is, I think, what will get countries like Tunisia out of the problems that they are having. Now, democracy is very fragile, right? And it's fragile largely because of the economic pressures that the country is under. Earlier this year, people took to the streets. They protested against structural adjustments that are being imposed by the IMF that led to austerity measures that are very, very difficult to swallow for the average Tunisian. Those protests, to me, were reminiscent of the protests that we witnessed in Spain and in Greece a few years ago. Much more so than they were of the Arab uprisings of 2011. That's a practice of democracy, okay? So I don't think that economic conditions have to improve before you have democracy. Economic conditions have not improved in Tunisia, and you have a democracy that's at work. It's fragile, but it is at work. Next month, they will have municipal elections, so there will be more decentralized governance, and I think more of an opportunity to stake a position in the economic future of the country. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but maybe we can talk more during the reception.
Professor Masri, we are delighted that you are a fellow of the
Thank you.
Policy Association.
Thank you. Thank you very much.